Hi, good afternoon. I'm so happy to see you. I'm Dr. Robin Gould, and you're at LMNetwork.tv. I'm so happy you've come back to the channel and back to my program so that we can have some time together today um, to talk about something I feel like is really important and really misunderstood. But I just want to make a quick mention that on March the 27th, there's going to be a 10th anniversary, 10 years of broadcasting for our Messianic Lamb radio was how it started. But anyway, show up and check that out. It's I think from 1 to 4 Eastern time, I believe. But double check that. Go to the website and check into that. And Allergy Day. Yep, here we go. But anyway, I wanted to just welcome you and just thank you for being here. And just remember, the future begins now. So maybe you might learn something new today, might be reminded of something. And we're going to kind of segue into something that's kind of in our culture now that is a kind of a challenging issue for believers, particularly to deal with, really anyone to deal with. But I'm not doing the portion today. Sometimes we talk about the portion. The portion is beautiful today. Check it out. It talks about the priestly garments, the jewels, the stones, all these different things, the colors. It's really neat. Go ahead. There's so many amazing people that teach on that. And that is not my lane. I love learning about it and I love enjoying and being a passenger in that lane, but that is not my lane. I am not a temple teacher. I look up to and have mentors that are temple teachers, but I'm an attachment specialist and I'm a marriage and family therapist and an attachment specialist, very specifically working through religious issues. So that's what I do. So I wanted to bring something up today. So future begins now, and now we're going to start. Now, what I want to do is I want to read just First Corinthians. Okay, so it's Paul speaking. And I just want to read chapter 10. That's it, just that one chapter. And then I just wanted to talk about a very specific part of this letter that is taken completely wrong and has injected society with confusion. And Paul is no stranger to saying confusing things. Paul can be a very controversial figure. He's been kind of the capstone of Christianity in what I would say in a very, because of the things he said that has been misunderstood. But of course, you even have Peter saying that the things that Paul says are very easy to misconstrue if you're not stable in your faith. And if you are either double-minded for a bad reason, you can take what he would say and twist it for your own benefit. Or if you just don't know what you're talking about, you're going to not get what he's saying. He speaks very about deeper things, right? I personally think Paul is very strongly a Musar thinking type of person. But I want you to remember that, like I said, the Bible was written, for you, but not to you. And so a lot of these letters, now there are people that get so disconcerted with some of the things that Paul says that they don't want to do the acrobats to figure it out. I'm not saying that's to insult anyone. They're saying we can leave Paul out and everything's fine and we're not having to do all these arguments. Now, I personally like Paul and think that there's a lot of good things he says. And I think there's a deep mystery he excavates and has been given that information. So I really, enjoy teaching about that. I teach about that in my divorce book, Divorce and Remarriage in the Bible. It's my Becky book, that book right there. So you can just check that out. Super cheap. Get it on Amazon or whatever. But I want to talk about this one thing that he says that is so commonly used against the Torah, right? So Paul, says he was the ultimate student of Torah. He's like, never would go against Torah. And even though he says that so many times, he seems to say to some people that have not been able to excavate what I'm going to kind of unearth today. They don't know this, right? Because they just haven't been taught this. And they would think that Paul came with something new and exciting. And then they'll put that in with, well, Yeshua or the Messiah, Jesus, he said something that seemed to be new too. Well, when you put it on the heels of misunderstanding Paul, it's certainly going to help you misunderstand the Messiah and vice versa, right? So Paul and Yeshua, when put together and studied properly, bolster Torah to the heart level but used in unison, not understanding what they're saying and to whom they speak and what they're addressing really. And when you don't even know the Torah, you are definitely going to get lost. So or if you, did I just say that wrong? If you read them properly, it bolsters Torah. But if you don't, you could easily get left behind from all the scholars will just run off ahead of you and know, and you won't know. You'll be back struggling with doctrine. So anyway, but let's get going. I just want to start, and I'm going to just read chapter 10, and then we're going to talk, because I want to read the whole chapter to give you context to what I'm going to speak on, because it's so important. Okay, and you'll know when I get there what a pivotal verse this is and how often it's used to really promote a misunderstanding. Okay, so he says, I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our forefathers were all under the cloud and they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moshe in the cloud and the sea. And they all ate the same spiritual food. They drank the same spiritual drink. And they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them. And that rock was the Messiah. Nevertheless, the Father was not pleased with them, with most of them, for they were struck down in the wilderness. Okay, so you know all that, right? He's just reiterating this in this letter. These things took place as examples to keep us from craving evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it was written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry, right? So that was super bad, more than mischief, right? We should not commit sexual immorality as some of them did. Now, they all didn't, right? And in one day, 23,000 of them died. We should not test Yeshua, meaning he was provided for a specific reason. Don't go outside the scope of that reason and think of him in any other way, right? As some of them did and were killed by snakes. Now, you might say there was no Messiah at that time. Yes, there was. He was slain at the foundation of the world. Remember this, okay? They were killed by snakes, and do not complain as some of them did. And they were killed by the destroying angel. Now, these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us. Now, that's not the only reason these things happened. They happened and were written down, but there was a purpose for each. There's a consequence for each action, right? That's what he's saying. There's a consequence, right? These things happened as a consequence. On whom the fulfillment of the ages have come. Okay, so basically, if you're reading this now, nothing new under the sun is really what I hear him saying. So the one who thinks he is standing firm should be careful not to fall. So basically, don't let your confidence, the tortoise and the hare, right? Don't let your confidence think that you're going to win the race if you're not running. You have to keep running, right? No temptation has seized you except that is common to man. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. So it says, when you are tempted, he will also provide an escape so that you can stand up under it. So a lot of people would say, I have faced temptations I could not do. And what he's saying is, everybody is equally tempted. Like, nothing is going to be so bizarre that you can't handle it. Coming from him, of course, right? No one's going to be tempted in general. I would say no one is going to be tempted by the Father. Okay, that's my opinion, Robin's opinion. You go with that, and that's not central to my point here, but that you just go with that as you will. And then he's saying, therefore, my beloved. So because of these things I just said, flee from idolatry. Speak to reasonable people. Judge for yourselves what I say. Okay, do you hear what he's saying? He's not saying he's speaking scripture. That is probably a challenge for some people to believe, and they might disagree with me. And it's okay if we disagree on that. This is a letter to a particular people thousands of years ago that came out of a particular belief system and needed discipleship. Really, that's what we're dealing here. He's like, speak to reasonable people, judge for yourself what I say. So you're going to come to this conclusion because what I'm saying is legit and reasonable. Okay. Is not the cup of blessing that we bless a participation in the blood of the Messiah? And is not the bread that we break a participation in the body of the Messiah? Because there's one loaf. We who are many are one body, but we all partake of the one loaf. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices fellow partakers in the altar? Am I suggesting then that food sacrificed to an idol is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, he's not saying that an idol is anything. He believes an idol is a nothing. But for the people who are going to be disloyal to God Almighty, that in the person is the sin that they would idolize and worship another god, right? He says no, the idol is nothing, but the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons, not to God, right? So these are just demons, and I do not want you to be participant with demons. So even though they're not powerful and they're nothing in terms of overcoming a believer, right? It says you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons too. So he's talking about singularity, not dualism, right? So dualism is where there's two things competing that fight for your attention and your loyalty, right? But he's saying this is the loyalty issue, even though a demon is nothing. If it was sacrificed to a demon, don't eat it. Okay. Now, I'm going to get further into that, but here's where we go. It says, you cannot partake in the table of the Lord and the table of demons too. Okay, so there's some issues of intent here, but let me just keep going because that's not the most important thing. Are we trying to provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he is? Okay. Now he says, everything is permissible. Everything is permissible, he says. But not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible, but not everything is edifying. No one should seek his own good, but the good of others. Eat anything sold in the meat market. He keeps going back to food, right? Eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience. Basically, it already mentioned if something was sacrificed to demons, right? The demon is nothing, but he doesn't want you to partake in the table of demons. So now I think he's clarifying what he's saying. For the earth is all the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So if the earth is the Lord's, he gets to define each and everything. He gets to define each animal as clean and unclean. He gets to define what the earth is, what people are, right? He makes definitions and we follow them. Okay. But if an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go eat anything, of course, this would be about what was sold in the meat market before you without raising questions of conscience. But if somebody tells you the food was offered to idols, not is this pork or shellfish or a blue dart frog and you're going to die in 10 seconds, like he's not talking about that. A lot of people will use this to justify eating unclean. It doesn't work. But if someone tells you that this food was offered idols, your conscience knows this, then you don't eat it. Now, if they're selling chicken in the market, which they are, and you don't know anybody ever spoke anything to it, because speaking to a chicken doesn't make it unclean, because the chicken of itself is from the Lord, and he says it's clean. But he says, but for the sake of the person who told you that it was sacrifice, that words were spoken to it that said this is now given to a nothing demon, for the other's conscience, he says, I mean, not your own, you're not going to eat it. For why should my freedom be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake in the meal with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God, and do not become a stumbling block to whether to Jews or Greeks or the church of God, as I also try to please everyone in all I do. For I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many, that they may be saved. Okay, now really important things here we want to talk about. Okay, I want to bring something out is that we want to understand that if a person of another religion takes your kosher piece of steak and says, I dedicate this to this demon, that doesn't change the steak. The steak is still a clean item that you are allowed to eat. But if you're, period, like that's it. The Father defined, you can eat this. It doesn't matter. He's discrediting the power or the authority or status of demons. No matter what people say to an item, it doesn't change the item. The earth is the Lord's. But for the good of others, like say you're with new believers or you're with people that are struggling with the issues or whatever, you're with all these people and they're like, you wouldn't eat that, would you? He's like, don't eat it. It's going to prick your conscience that you're partaking in the table of demons. Even though that steak is not affected, do what's good for the group. And all of you show your loyalty by saying, we're just not going to eat it. Okay, so he's trying to give them some practical advice on how to deal with dualism. Because I want to talk about dualism. I want to talk about what that looked like in that day. And it's important that we know about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quote some commentary. It's short. About Gnosticism. Okay. And I'll tell you who wrote it at the end so you can remember the name. And I quote, when the Apostle John wrote his first epistle near the end of the first century, the Gnostic philosophy had swept through the Roman world and had already made serious inroads into the church. Paul fights this in some of his letters, particularly in 1 Corinthians, in Galatians, and Colossians. And I write about all of these in my Becky books. But here you get John. He tries to counter some of this person views. John is countering this in his writings. Now, forget that because I don't believe that. However, a primary belief of Gnosticism, I just want to give you context. I wasn't not in full agreement with all of this guy's points, but here's what is important. The primary belief of Gnosticism was dualism, and that is true. Okay, that is something very interesting. I wouldn't suggest going and studying it beyond the scope of understanding it for the sake of what is this letter saying. Don't dabble, don't get interested, just enough that you know what not to believe and what to believe. Okay, don't get jazzed up by it. But this idea purports that a cosmological conflict of antithetic forces exists and will always be polar opposites. So, and he says in plain English, so he's giving you a different way to word this. This means that throughout time and space, certain contrary forces have and will struggle against each other. So when he defines these forces as matter and spirit, evil and good, darkness and light, and he says this is where you're getting that Oriental yin and yang, right? And in such a dualistic system, no overlapping or gray areas allowed. Okay. Now, what happened was, and according to this person, is that this belief, when paired with the Gnostic premise that there's this like special knowledge, right? Gnosticism, but this special knowledge, it's in your head, it's a belief or whatever of salvation. It leads the Gnostics to this manifests in their belief system in these two dueling ways. And I write about this in my Becky books. But one would be that the only way, and I'm still quoting him here, the only way to attain true spirituality is to deny their flesh, which would be the matter, of anything that might tempt them to sin. So I write about this in Colossal Controversies, where we talk about asceticism, harsh treatment of the body, do not taste, do not touch, like complete self denial, don't enjoy life at all, suffer, be a martyr on purpose, no matter what, just find places, ways you can martyr yourself, whatever. So that's asceticism. The opposite extreme would be that things that are done in the body, right? The physical body are inconsequential. That doesn't even matter, right? So that's the other extreme. This pendulum went from here to here, right? Because only the spirit counts. Nothing in the flesh that you do matters. It's really your intent, your spirit, what you believe it is, subjective truth, my truth, whatever. These Gnostics often fell, of course, into licentiousness because obviously. So now this person's name is Richard T. Rittenbaugh. So I just wanted to let you know who I was discussing, because I think he does have an understanding of dualism, and that's who Paul was writing to. Now, this is the part I want to talk about. Ready? When Paul says everything is permissible. Okay, now many people will say Paul is teaching us that, yeah, I mean, Messiah came, so of course we're under grace, not law, and everything is permissible. Okay. Now let me challenge here. Okay, one hair in the wrong place. There we go. So I want to challenge you here. We read the letter where Paul is talking about how people die as a consequence sometimes to sin, to breaking the law. Don't do that, he says. And even for conscience sake, even if you're allowed to eat steak that someone spoke negatively to, don't do it if it's going to be a stumbling block for other people. If it's going to challenge their feeling of loyalty and community and you as a mentor, don't do it. That's what he's saying. He's saying that's what's going to be best, because everybody is coming out of this duality system. Now, what he's doing here, he says everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible, but not everything is edifying. Now, one thing that people don't really know is a lot of times you got to go into the interlinear, and you've got to look this up to understand what I'm saying. I will describe it to you, but go and look it up. Okay. The word but there, I think it's Strong's 235. But when you look this up, everything is permissible. Now, obviously, Paul does not believe everything is permissible, because he just listed bad consequences and tells you even if it's fine to eat the steak, don't if it's going to hurt someone else. Do everything for the glory of God, right? All right. But don't sin. He's not going to say don't sin and then there's no such thing as sin. So the word but is not just but. It's on the contrary. That's what that word really means. It's on the contrary. Everything is permissible. On the contrary, not everything is beneficial. So why is he saying everything is permissible? Well, he's not saying it. He's refuting it. He's repeating the slogan of the Gnostic belief that anybody can do anything. That's what he's doing. He's quoting it. But since he doesn't agree with it, because he's already put it into context and said he doesn't agree with it at all, he's refuting it and giving you, on the contrary, everything can't be beneficial, because when you speak to reasonable people, this is reasonable what I'm saying, right? He says not everything's beneficial. Why would a good God, that the earth is, everything belongs to him, why would he make everything permissible if it was going to hurt you or others? How is that law? How is that order? How is that a good God, a good parent? Not all of it's good. Why would he permit bad things? Why would he permit things that were not beneficial? the essence of the law is for the hardest of men's heart, because we need to operate in things that are beneficial, right? Then he quotes it again. Everything is permissible. On the contrary, not everything is beneficial. I mean, everything is permissible. On the contrary, not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible. On the contrary, not everything is edifying. So no one should seek his own good, but the good of others. So he's not undoing Torah or saying everything is permissible. He's saying absolutely not is everything permissible. It's not beneficial. You are not permitted to eat a blue dart frog. You will die in 10 seconds. Now, that's not why it tells you not to eat a blue dart frog, right? That's a good contender. It checks off a box in my list why my father would say, this is for you to eat and this is for you not to eat, right? There's a lot of things on the planet that have a job that just doesn't necessarily mean it's food. So Paul is quoting this idea that there is no such thing as sin in the body. This Gnostic philosophy. Now they went from asceticism, where they couldn't eat anything, couldn't do anything, to Gnosticism, where, hey, if your heart is pure in its intent, do whatever you want. That's duality. That's dualism. Those are competing things, okay? They are both wrong. They're both wrong, right? And he has to teach these people that came from these religious systems for these fake little g gods, and he's got to help them understand the one and only God, who has boundary markers, laws, things in stone, literally written in stone, that we do and don't do. Okay, so he is quoting their misbelief, their wrong belief, and telling them why. That's ridiculous that you would think everything is permissible when it's not beneficial or edifying. Okay, that leads me into what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about intent. Now, this is a big conversation. I mean, we're fitting it into like 55 minutes or 50 minutes or whatever, and I know that is a challenge, but we'll do our best, okay? Now, let's talk about intent. A lot of people think that just even having a thought of something is a sin. Okay, now I'm not the smartest person in the world. I don't know everything. I will say that thoughts will enter your mind, right? It's oak season. Tell you what, you're going to have to deal with me and the tissues. Okay. Thoughts will enter your mind. It is not a sin that a thought enters your mind. What do you do with that thought? What do you do with it? A thought comes into you walk into a store and there's a table full of folded sweaters. They're all your favorite color. You are wearing a large sweatshirt. Could very easily stick a sweater underneath there. Just look like a pregnant woman leaving the store. This is a time when there were no cameras. You could just very easily steal that, right? So maybe you stand in front of the count. Maybe you stand in front of this table. You see all these sweaters in your favorite color, and no one's looking, and you could very easily steal this sweater. So the thought comes into your mind. So you could say, oh, forgive me, Father, for even having that thought, and then walk away from the table and leave. Now, it's not a sin to have the thought, but some people want to cover their bases and say, oh, I'm sorry I even thought that. But the point wouldn't be that I'm repenting for a thought that came into my head. What they would be saying is, I know you forbid stealing. So the fact that that even circled my brain, ew, right? Write the Torah on my heart so that doesn't even come up anymore. Now, most people go into a store now and they never consider stealing. Torah's on their heart there. It's just not even on their radar. And they disdain people who do steal. Okay. The intent, the thought, is not the intent. That's just part of the information. This is what you're encountering, right? I'm encountering this thought. I'm opting to ignore it. And in fact, say, ooh, Lord, help me. I don't want to ever be tempted. I don't want to, I don't want that. I don't want to do that. Now, the Messiah says, and there are people, they go through false guilt here. Like when Messiah says, whoever even looks upon a married woman with lust is already committed adultery. What is he really saying there? Lust, not attraction or interest or intrigue because a woman walked by and she was beautiful and you looked and thought, well, that was a beautiful woman, right? Looking upon with lust would be nurturing these feelings. It would be embracing the intent. It would be letting it flourish. It wouldn't be the righteous action of struggling with this before the God you love, the Father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and saying, that was a really beautiful person, and it's a struggle. That's a righteous, authentic prayer and struggle with the Father that you and him together have victory over, right? You work through it. That thought that came into your head wasn't the sin. What the Messiah is saying is it's all about your intent. Now, in Gnosticism, in asceticism, or whatever, in different people's views, we dabble into asceticism in Christianity, and they dabble in it. They dabble also in Gnosticism, right? Because we got a lot of New Age, New Thought stuff. I'm going to tell you something. There is such thing as sin, and it's breaking God's law. Intent can mean two things. Thoughts are not a sin. Actions can be if they break the law. So don't go into false guilt if you had a thought. If you act on it, you need to repent and do restitution and do whatever, right? But false guilt says that thought came into my head. Well, that's a human thought. That's not the issue. What do you do with this thought when you're standing before the pile of sweaters that are all your favorite color? You walk away. So the Messiah is letting you know thoughts that turn to lust, not just interest or like something caught your eye, lust. When you lust after something, it means that you take it in as you're constantly thinking about it. It's basically like you might as well know that you're going to act on it. So the thought that came into your head wasn't the problem. It was that you lusted. It was that you continue to nourish it. So it leads to action, right? But if the thought alone wasn't the problem, it was the action. And when you have a thought and you obey the Father rather than indulge and really kind of nourish and pet that thought, like that's what's pleasing to the Father, right? So a lot of people will say, like, I remember hearing Bill Cloud. It was so funny. He was talking about eating clean, and he's like, I meet a lot of people and they say, oh, if I'm even around something unclean and it's cooking, I'm literally grossed out. And he goes, and I don't know if maybe I'm just not as holy as y'all, but I grew up on pork and I've not eaten it in 20 and 35 years for sure once I learned or whatever. But he said, I never really think the smell is bad or whatever. And he's like, I don't know who dares to admit that. But what's interesting about that to me is when I deal with people that are always condemning themselves just for their thoughts, just constant condemnation of like, that thought came into my head. I'm like, well, did you act on it? No. What did you do? I prayed like that thought would go away. I mean, if the smell of something unclean cooking turns you off, that's really easy. You're just easily aversive to that thing. But how much more intimate connection, obedience, loyalty is it where, wow, it just still smells good. I grew up on it. I remember how much I used to like eating that. And I'm not going to do it though. I think that kind of is like a real holy moment there. The fact that it's still a temptation that you don't act on. So that doesn't mean we're not, he doesn't go home and think, oh, I keep thinking about with those ribs and I want to eat them. No, he just lets it go. But he admits, it's still one of those things that, it still smells good to me. Like I'm just saying, right? So I admire that, right? So now I personally, don't like those smells because I don't know if I associate it with like just going down the wrong path, or if really there are things in that are unclean in those things. Like it could be a combination of all that, but a thought is a thought. Gnosticism says that there's basically no way that you can sin in your body as long as your heart is pure, so to speak. It's truly your thought and your intent that is everything. And it doesn't matter, what you do. Doesn't matter what your body does. Your body, matter doesn't matter. Only spirit, only intent, only ideas, only metaphoric inertias. Like that's Gnosticism. Asceticism is the opposite, that it's all your physical body that proves your spirituality, right? So these are these dueling, competing, regional religious outpourings that they're trying to pull back in and wash themselves up and just get rid of. That's what the people are dealing with. And so Paul is not telling you, that everything's permissible. He just got done telling you how everything is not permissible. So then he goes in and says, now here's your your slogan. That can't be. So you need to get rid of that slogan and you need to act in the glory of God. Because the Father sets you up for things that are good for you, good for him, good for the community. Do that stuff. That's what he's saying. Because a little further, if we want to even juice this orange a little more, like get a little more out of this, in many ways, freedoms and bennies are a prison for us. And I was just having this conversation the other day with somebody. We were talking about being trapped by your benefits, right? And this is where, our portion over the last month and 2 months, it's like, well, we had, leeks and onions and cucumbers where we were in Egypt. At least we had that, right? Trapped by security, trapped by benefits, right? Being in a job we hate for 35 years because the benefits were so good, but your quality of life was, right? There's a truth to, well, we can't always get what we want. And sometimes we have to do things we don't want, but sometimes we can make changes, but we don't because we are trapped with, well, that's the word, trappings, right? We're trapped by our benefits. So let's see here. If we're talking about trapping by our benefits, let's talk about the prison of freedom. Okay, so here's what I'm talking about. When some people get the idea that they get to, okay, now I'm not judging you here. I go by the Hillel calendar. I'm going to bring up a calendar issue. If you go by a different calendar, we're friends. I love you. It's good. We're good. I'm using this as an example. Okay. One thing I love about doing the Hillel calendar is that Judah has made that call and I'm just going with it. I don't have the freedom to look into that because I believe Judah holds the scepter because it says that and it's written, Judah holds the scepter. I go with that. Now, when I didn't understand that years and years and years ago, and it was actually a really long time ago, and I still remember it like it was yesterday because it was so painful. It was like, okay, I'm going to have to study this out really carefully to figure this out because I don't want to make a mistake. And let me tell you something. I went through literally every calendar study, conjunction, sliver, sighting in Israel, blah, 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 blah. What, you name it, I studied it. And there's a lot to that because you have to read basically the whole Bible to figure it out. And I kept finding that every study yielded good fruit, kind of. Like, that makes sense. That's a really good point. And while this one might make more good points than this one, it still doesn't check off the box this one checks off here. And it was a mess for me. It was a mess. It was literally torture. It was like, I am so stressed. I don't know the answer. Why isn't the Father telling me the answer? What is the answer? And the answer I got very clearly, and I'll remember the chair I was sitting in. I'll remember the moment it was spoken to me across a dinner table by somebody. And I remember, and I pair that with another moment, maybe a couple weeks before, with the words of my husband saying to me, right? But these things came together. Might sound like, oh, you listened to someone else and not your husband. No, this was a confirmation. The answer is that it's not your answer to give. And I'll tell you what, I felt like the gate of heaven opened to me in that freedom out of that prison of freedom, right? The freedom of you get to figure that out. That's your job. That's your thing. That was a prison. I was constantly distracted by that issue, not wanting to make a mistake. When I was delivered from that freedom, I was finally free to enjoy the feast and to just go with the group, because that is, and you know what? There are people that will teach you the opposite of that. Are we united in error or divided in error? I just don't buy into that. I saw nothing but division, and even good-hearted division was driving me crazy. So okay, let's play into something a lot more serious here that's kind of in our culture. I recently discovered that a person that I kind of liked a lot, or it's always disappointing. They say never meet your heroes, right? So there was someone, and I'm not going to say who, and it's someone in the media, but I didn't know this, but they came out very strongly that they bragged about a medical procedure they had at a very famous organization that I absolutely abhor and have nothing to do with, because it's a homicidal situation with unborn. So I'm using words because I don't want to get all people in trouble here. And I found out this person was very open and bragging that they had used their services in something that I believe, and I'm sure you believe, is abhorrent and homicidal. And they had done that, and they were proud of it. Now they were within the law because the law allowed this, because they had the freedom to do it. They were free to go and do this. Okay, so this leads me into the point I was trying to make. So what's the freedom that they're protecting? Recreational, physical act of intimacy. Recreational. That's what they want to protect. At what cost? At the cost of another person's life. Now, even people who believe it should be up to the person who is the vessel carrying the other person, a lot of those people even think, you're the day before your due date. No, I'm not for that. But as it's written, and with politicians, they say, so what you're saying is even the day before the due date, that is legal, that baby is killed. And they're like, yeah, that's how it's written. It's got to be this way to be this way. Otherwise, it's a slippery slope and we start losing our rights. Okay. That's freedom? Because that is the only answer. Because when you're doing something wrong, there's no good answer. You have to let the atrocities happen to do what you think, which I still think is an atrocity, but they don't think it is at a certain earlier time. To protect what? The freedom of this recreational physical intimacy with people. That's the most important thing to them. What's on the chopping block? A person. For the freedom of this recreational act. The balance is this recreational act worth killing this person? We've lost our way, my friends, because we're like, yep, it's worth it. Okay, but then who's in a prison? The woman that's given this choice when she's down and out and worried and stressed, and because it's built into society as an answer, as a solution, there's not much of a deterrent for either partner to be like much more careful, maybe abstain. It's built in as a solution, right? When you are opening a menu in a restaurant and there's just a lot of choices, it can be overwhelming. You're like, oh, I'll just get the hamburger. I don't even know. There's so many things. Well, the freedom to make that choice when you're not in your right frame of mind, maybe you don't have the right support system, maybe whatever. You have to live with the freedom of that, of the consequence of that freedom that you fought for. Like, it is not natural for our maternal instincts to be turned against our young. Like, to deny our maternal instincts, basically. What does that do to us as a species, as a community? Right? And then people will say, well, if she was, attacked, it's like, so she's a victim. And on the very same week, you make her a perpetrator. So she goes from a victim of a horrific crime to a perpetrator of a worse one. Like, that's not freedom. But on some level, it's viewed and promoted as security. At least we have this built into the system. Okay, so you see, freedom of benefits or whatever, it can be a prison. This isn't to promote any form of like communism or socialism or anything like that, but like in these ideas that in my heart, I wasn't ready for parenthood and so it didn't really matter what happened to my body or the other body. See, intent is nothing. It's what you do. Because we have to live with what we do. Now, if you are a person that's dealt with that in whatever form, maybe someone you love, your daughter or son, or people you love, or you yourself, I'm going to tell you something. The Father forgives us. I mean, I am not trying to lighten this issue and make it like trite or whatever, because I've dealt with people, try to help people go through terrible trauma surrounding that in their life. And I don't want them to feel condemned and unforgiven. And I don't want them to ever think that our God isn't that big, that he forgives all. And he does. He completely forgives you. But for the people that would argue with me, I do want to make my point that people suffer with that consequence and society suffers with that. So freedom isn't always free, right? Freedom is lonely. Freedom is in many times like, ooh, security can be a trap too. And that's another show for another time. And of course, we have enough of that in society that we're talking about. That's a meme around every corner. But the things that we think we want to be free in, and many times put us in a trap. And I've heard women describe that. I felt like I was in a trap and I had to choose this thing for all of these reasons. And everyone felt better around me or whatever it was, but I feel terrible and I walk with this. I'm the one that lives with this. I wish I wasn't given that option. That freedom trapped me. That health insurance plan kept me in that job where I could have actually written that novel or done a different job or whatever. Like, so sometimes security can be our worst enemy. Sometimes freedom can. It's all going to be about do it for the glory of God and for the good of others. And that flows in with what is the Torah summed up as? Loving the Lord your God with your whole heart, strength, mind, everything about you, and loving your neighbor as yourself. You keep doing all of those things at the same time, and guess what? You're doing it. You're successful. You're not just good inside, you're good outside, right? Good intentions get you nowhere unless you reach goals of good doing. We are not, justified by actions or thoughts or beliefs. Okay, so it's much more than that. So it's very important that we understand these are really important themes to think about. And what Paul is saying is that if the slogan of your life is that you can do whatever you want, rethink that, because it's not going to help you or others. It's not edifying. It's not beneficial. So no, you may not do that. Do not do those wrong things. Don't do things that hurt you and others and violate the law of God. So whenever you are talking to people and they bring up 1 Corinthians 10, and then they say, well, the Apostle Paul says everything's permissible. You can say to them, the Apostle Paul does not say that. He quotes their belief system and refutes it. He sets it up by letting them know how important it is not to sin. He quotes their slogan, and then he says, no. And he refutes it with a reasonable discussion. It's not edifying. It's not beneficial. So why would a good God say do bad things and hurt yourself and it's all good? No. The Father doesn't allow us to sin. We choose to sin, but he didn't make us as robots either. But if we ask the Father, should I go steal that guy's car? He'd be like, no, I already told you that. He'd say, what did Moses say? Yeah, that's already in stone. So if you go and rob that guy's car, that guy's not going to be like, Father, why did you allow that to happen? The Father's going to be like, I didn't allow it. But I don't make robots. Everyone has free will. So remember that don't over-spiritualize things. Don't under-spiritualize things. Be reasonable. Follow the commandments. Understand that they are for your good. And even if you don't understand them, even if there is one unclean animal that you can't prove that it's got some unclean physicality to it, that doesn't give you permission to go and eat it. That's not the reason that you're obeying the dietary laws. It's attachment and loyalty and connection and obedience and trust and all of that good stuff that is attachment. That's why we obey our Father. It's our identity as children of his family to follow the rules that our Father sets forth for us. And it shows that we are not just obedient robots, we're faithful children that trust our Father because we believe that he is good. And when we understand his identity as good, we will understand our identity as his. And we benefit from the good because everything he tells us to do is beneficial and edifying. There's a lot of stuff in the Bible we do not understand. That's okay. In due time, my friend, my beloved friends, you will figure stuff out little by little. But the Paul thing, it's a big thing, right? Paul is complicated with the way he talks. Now, not to these people, they understood it. But to us now, we like to take Paul and pluck him out and say, Paul says, I can blah, blah, blah. Even if it's not beneficial. It's not that I can't. It's that I shouldn't. No, Paul is not saying that. He's saying, on the contrary, that's not reasonable. And he said, speak to reasonable people to double check what I'm saying. Gnosticism, not reasonable. Asceticism, not reasonable. These aren't reasonable things. It's because the little g gods that head these things up hate you. They hate good things. They're just gross, whatever they are. I don't even know what they are. But little g gods aren't gods. They could just be our own evil inclinations. I don't know. I'm not an expert on all that. But I do know that we aren't to partake at the table of demons. And we all eat from the same bread. We all drink from the same cup. We all have the same absolute one and only Almighty Most High God that tells us how to live. He doesn't make it a secret. So I really hope you enjoyed this today. I hope you learned something. I hope it kind of touched parts of your life that made sense to you and maybe are even good for you. Maybe help you out of a tough spot where maybe you weren't sure about something. I don't know. But I hope there was something practical in it for you today. And I want you to know that the future begins now. And that means you, yes, you. The Father loves you. And I can't wait to see you next week. And until then, bye.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.